Welcome back. So, Friday's sees an EU-Russian summit that Germany's foreign minister is already predicting will be a difficult meeting. Eastern European EU members want the older established Western countries to take a much tougher stand with Russia on a range of issues. There's already tension after riots in Estonia sparked by the decision of the Estonian government to remove a statue commemorating Russian dead from the Second World War, riots that revived memories of the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. Poland is demanding action over a ban on Polish meat imports, a ban allegedly imposed on health grounds. Poland, in turn, is vetoing EU negotiations with Russia on a new strategic pact. And this against the background of a Russia with newfound confidence underpinned by the revenues from its oil and gas riches and the growing reliance of much of Europe on those fuel supplies.
Thank God there are no conflicts. There are differences of opinion on how to solve specific problems, but both sides have a desire to solve them.
Well, let's consider those specific problems. Still with us, Dmitry Suslov in Moscow and Ariel Cohen in Washington. And joining us from our London studios is Oksana Antonenko, a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and an editor of a recent study on Russian-EU relations. Let me start off with you. This summit planned for Friday, is it going to be what has been billed an acrimonious flop?
Well, it is definitely going to be a summit without substance, but with a lot of emotions. We are now seeing the second summit when negotiations over partnership and cooperation agreement, which expires at the end of the year, have been postponed. Now it is due to not one, but two and possibly three vetoes from the European Union. So it is a complete deadlock. And this is happening all against the background of growing economic interdependency between the European Union and Russia. But politically, they simply are not able to find a common ground. And I think frustrations are now mounting, and it is very hard to see how the relationship can be put back on track.
How much of this acrimony has got to do with history, with the legacy of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe?
Well, it is at the moment all about that legacy. Western European countries that are quite keen to move on to negotiate partnership with Russia. I think they see Russia very much as a strategic partner, an important player. But for many Central European countries, particularly Russian neighbors in the Baltic states and Poland, it is very important first to deal with historic legacies, and only then are they prepared to move on. And they are holding this negotiation hostage. And of course, it is very difficult for today's Russia, which is more self-confident, more national, to acknowledge the difficult historic legacies. So again, it is very hard to see how this can be changed until the elites change.
And does this
as a result of that,
does this increasingly confident Russia, this revived Russia, pose some sort of threat to these countries?
Well, I think it is not a threat which we traditionally would understand to be a threat. It is not a military threat. It is not a political threat, because at the end, they both are, all of them are now members of the European Union and NATO. It is maybe to some extent an economic threat, because some countries have experienced, for example, Lithuania at the moment, the Russian oil is no longer supplied to Lithuania, allegedly due to technical faults. But I think it is not the threat which drives them. It is the fact that they are now members of the club, and they really hope for the European solidarity in addressing some of those issues, which for Eastern European countries is very much part of shaping their national identity.
Mr. Suslov, does Russia see this EU expansion as a way for many countries to deal with historic scores?
Russia was concerned about the expansion of the European Union, but I don't think that we have so much troubles with the EU, and I'm speaking about the absence of negotiations on the new PCA, or the new Strategic Partnership Treaty. To tell the truth, Russia is thankful to Poland for vetoing the mandate of the Commission, because otherwise Russia would be faced with really hard negotiations without any prospect of their conclusion. Russia's interests on certain strategic aspects, on certain strategic problems, contradict absolutely to the interests of the European Commission, to the interests of the European Union in general. And here I mean first and foremost the energy field and the free trade area. And I can't see any prospect for concluding those negotiations beneficiary for two sides. Either the mandate of the Commission would be violated, or certain Russian interests would be violated.
So,
it is not acceptable for both sides.
Mr. Cohen, it doesn't seem like there's going to be much movement on Friday. How is the US viewing these weakening relations between Russia and the rest of Europe?
United States is concerned, among other things, about the increasing energy dependency of Europe on Russia. Today, Russia is supplying 40% of Europe's gas and probably 90% of Central and Eastern European gas. Germany is increasing its dependency on Russian gas, and Russia is signing agreements with Algeria and is trying to build a global cartel on natural gas, which will affect Europe most of all. In addition to that, we hear from Mr. Suslov that Russia is distancing itself from the European Union. It is distancing itself from the United States. But who is Russia getting close to? It's getting close to Iran. It's getting close to China. And it is viewing its own security as a zero-sum game vis-a-vis its European neighbors. So this is a worrisome development, and taken together with Russian intransigence on security issues, and now we hear from Mr. Suslov on Russian intransigence on economic issues, we still are hoping that Russia will find its way to find compromise, both outside its borders with its neighbors, which we should remember, like Estonia or Poland, are not only much smaller neighbors, but historically were under Russian occupation for tens and hundreds of years. And also that Russia will learn to find compromises within its own body politic, between different parts of its society. We noticed how 9,000 heavily armed policemen beat up a 2,000 strong so-called march of the dissenters. This was straight from the Soviet playbook. And unfortunately, we do not see how the upcoming election cycle is going to change that anytime soon.
Okay, Mr. Antonetto, Mr. Cohen, you mentioned the election cycle there, which is coming up for Russia. But how has the change in leadership across Europe affected Russia, or will affect Russia looking forward?
Well, it is clearly complicates relationship between Russia and Europe. The whole generation of leaders that used to take Russia very seriously and in fact advocated much stronger bilateral ties with Russia, such as Schroeder or Mr. Chirac or even Tony Blair, are now left the scene. And the new generation of leaders are much more skeptical about Russia. They really came to power already seeing domestic developments in Russia, which are in a way turning back from democracy. And actually are much more prepared to assume a common European position, at least, if not in regard to interest, but definitely in regard to values. And here, Russia is not prepared or see it with great irritation that Europe wants to talk to Russia about values, which, of course, now differ between the current Russia and current Europe. But I think in the long run, Europe really has no other choice but to come closer to Russia. And I hope that the new leadership will find a way to rediscover their ability to engage with Russia constructively and hopefully at some time also influence Russia towards returning back to the path of democracy, which of course is the main precondition for developing long-lasting strategic relationships.
And at the same time, Russia is flexing its diplomatic muscle. Is that a concern for Europe?
It is a concern for Europe, but I think Europe also understands that with Russia there remains to be interdependency. As much as Europe depends on Russian energy, Russia depends overwhelmingly over trade with Europe. More than 50% of Russia's trade is now with Europe. So Russia and also Europe, of course, western border is the only truly stable border in Russia. We see in Central Asia and the Caucasus even border with China, potentially posing serious strategic threats to Russia. So I think Europe also understands that Russia in the long run strategically has no other choice than to come closer to Europe. The problem is how to overcome the current accumulated set of problems and deadlocks, which again I don't think will be resolved until the leadership succession in Russia itself.
And one of them, concern for many, is Putin and his increasingly draconian laws. Mr. Cohen, is that a worry for the US? Should Europe have done more, very briefly?
Well, the problem with Europe, why Europe is not making its voice louder in these concerns, because these concerns, of course, affect the Europeans much more than they affect us. We're just further away from Russia. But Europe as such doesn't have an effective policy-making mechanism. The European Union, when it gathers with Mr. Putin in Samara this weekend, has no instruments for sustained and coherent policy making.
Sorry, Mr. Ern, we're going to have to leave it there because the time has come for the end of our program. There was Ariel Cohen, Dmitry Suslov in Moscow, Oksana Antonenko in London. Thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. And we welcome your suggestions and your comments. Goodbye.